Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, today with something a bit different, my first ever tier list for PvE. Now many people might say, but wait Ivano, you don't even play PvE. And to those people I would say, first of all, that is a blatant lie, because I will have you know that I cleared Eternity Vault and even Karaga's Palace many times. But of course there are people much more experienced than me in PvE, so this tier list was created in cooperation with LAKEY of the German raiding guild Clean. First of all, I want to say a big thanks to him for answering all my questions and helping me with this list. So if you're interested in nightmare raiding, I would highly recommend that you check out his stream. Link to that is in the description below. Since this is my first PvE tier list, I will quickly explain how I went about creating it. So first of all, we are focusing on Nightmare or Master Mode operations, because everything else, the classes that you play, don't really matter. Every class in the game can clear Story Mode and Hard Mode operations, and of course all the flashpoints as well. So if you want to get into that kind of content, then just play whatever you want. Of course, it is also true that different classes will perform better or worse in different operations, and even on different bosses within the same operation. So you can use this list as a kind of overall ranking of the average performance of all the classes in the game in the most challenging PvE content, which would be the Nightmare Mode operations, especially the most challenging ones such as Gods of the Machine, Nature of Progress, Dread Fortress, or maybe even the new R4 Anomaly, Hard Mode. Okay, but without further ado, we are going to start with the DPS classes. Then we're going to go to the tanks and finally the healers. And as always, we start at the bottom of the list, in D tier. Now, classes in D tier are the ones that are a little bit lacking on the DPS side and utility when it comes to the stronger specs. And the first one we have here is Concealment Operative. While it can do damage, it does a little bit less damage than some of the better classes in the game. But especially when it comes to AoE, it is just worse than Lethality. Concealment also struggles with doing damage in movement phases, and defensively it's also a bit on the weaker side. So while you can play Concealment, it is not optimal, and that's why it's in D tier. Next up we have Fury Marauder. Fury used to be really good, at least on the training dummy, but it did get nerfed a couple too many times. So as of now, it just has less DPS than Rage Juggernaut or the other Marauder specs. Also Fury has some of the same issues than Rage when it comes to Obliterate, sometimes involuntarily moving you into like a bad position, like a void on the ground or something like that. Overall, Fury is just the worst out of all of the Marauder specs, and that's why it sits in D tier. Deception is in a similar place. It does less DPS than Hatred. The utility is also not as good as some of the specs in the higher tiers, and that is why Deception sits together with Fury and Concealment in D tier. Moving on to C tier. Now these classes are okay when it comes to doing DPS, but they are not as good as their counterparts. Okay, so starting on the bottom, and here I would put the Rage Jug. Rage has good DPS, it's better than Fury, and the single target is even better than Vengeance, but to be honest, not by that much. And as soon as there are two targets to hit in the raid, Vengeance just takes over and Rage gets overshadowed. So that's what I mean with the classes that are not as good as their counterparts. So while you can play Rage in Nightmare Mode operations, at the highest level you should really ask yourself, why would you? If Vengeance does the same, and in most cases is just better. Lightning Sorcerer was good a while ago, around the time that the R4 Anomaly operation came out, but then it got nerfed, and even the recent buffs have not been enough. Single target for Lightning just kind of sucks. There are better options, and that's exactly why Lightning sits in C tier. Next up we have Arsenal Mercenary. Arsenal also struggles with doing DPS. Single target is just straight up worse than IO. The utility is not as good as some of the other classes in the game. So if you're looking for a ranged class that has utility, you would much rather bring a sniper compared to an Arsenal Merc, for example. That being said, Arsenal is quite tanky, and that's why we're putting it in C tier, above some of the classes that are in D tier maybe. And finally, on top of the C tier, but not quite good enough to make it into B tier, is the Marksman Sniper. Now, Marksman can do good DPS if you take the crit utility on penetrating blasts, but then you have very high energy costs. And if you ever run out of energy on Sniper, it's just RIP. That being said, Suppressive Fire and also the AoE penetrating blast that you can opt for are really insane when it comes to doing AoE. And you do have good utility being a sniper, but overall, while Marksman is certainly not the worst class in the game, it is not as good as the other sniper specs, so we are putting it at the top of C tier. Next we have B tier. Now the specs in B tier do good DPS, but usually they're not the best when it comes to utility, or there's some kind of trade-off with those classes. And Carnage is the perfect example. Carnage does more DPS than Fury, but it is lacking the utility of Annihilation. So while Carnage is playable, it is not the best at anything either, and that's why it sits in B tier. Now, if you want to play a ranged class that is good on most of the fights, I would recommend you play Madness or Innovative Ordnance. These classes are very solid when it comes to DPS, however, on some of the fights, such as Isaacs, they get outperformed, and there are simply better options when you want to play a ranged class, such as a Virulent Sniper, for example. Overall, that is why Madness and IO are playable, but not the best, B tier. Hatred Sin is another one of those cases. The DPS is really good, it is the highest parsing spec on the dummy, so very strong single target. AoE is also very strong, but the defensive cooldowns are not the best. So it's really a similar story to PvP here. Deflection only working versus white damage is not great, kind of sucks, and on the utility side, Hatred also doesn't bring that much to the raid table. So not the worst, not the best, a class with some strengths and also some weaknesses, B tier. And then finally, on top of B tier, we have the Lethality Operative. Now Lethality has very good single target and actually the second best AoE in the game. But you cannot have both at the same time. Because for AoE, you need to run the Viral Elements tactical, which significantly nerfs your single target. So that means if you want to bring AoE to a raid, you can run Lev, but then you will compromise your boss damage, and that's why Lethality is only B tier, because there are classes that can do both at the same time. So we are moving on to A tier, and these are classes that have very good DPS, but also good raid utility. Starting with Engineering Sniper. Engineering Sniper might have the highest single target sustained DPS, certainly for a ranged class, and also passive AoE damage with Plasma Probe, which is quite handy. So you can do AoE while you're doing your single target rotation on the boss. Being a sniper, it has great utility with Diversion, Ballistic Shield, and good defensives with Entrench for the AoE damage reduction, Roll, and so on. Really, the only drawback when it comes to engineering is that you need to replace your Plasma Probe in movement phases, which means a loss of DPS and can also fuck up your energy if you're not careful. Next up, Virulence Sniper, sitting solidly in A tier. I already mentioned Virulence a couple of times. It is a really well-rounded class for DPS. It has utility, cooldowns for burst windows with viral targeting, and even a little bit better defensives compared to NG. Overall, Virulent Sniper is the best range spec in the game, and that's why it sits in A tier. Next up, we have my favorite class, and the first of the PowerTechs, Advanced Prototype, sits in A tier. Now AP has seen some PvE buffs recently with a new tactical. Of course, also it's a PT, meaning it's quite tanky in PvE fights, has a very good uptime on the AoE damage reduction, and it can leech, which means that because you have Pyro Shield and Reflective Armor, you will actually gain DPS from taking some damage in a raid, meaning that you perform better in a raid scenario than on the training dummy. So AP overall is very strong, it's good in movement phases with hydraulics, can spec into 15 meter range, so even if you need to kite and avoid some mechanics, you can still keep doing damage on the boss. Single target is good, and burst is really high, which can come in handy for some DPS check phases. And that's why ABPT sits on the top of A tier. And now we get to the best DPS specs in the game. These are all classes that have great DPS, great utility, and also survivability, and you can play them on almost every fight. Starting with the Vengeance Jug. Now, initially I didn't have this one in S tier, But of course Gali knows better and told me to for sure put this in the S tier. Vengeance is similar to PvP actually, the AoE king also in PvE because of the cut to pieces tactical. But what I didn't know is that actually you can play that tactical for 80% of the fights, and already if there are 2 targets to hit, it will be better than Hemophilic Slash, which is the other single target tactical. So DPS wise, Vengeance is really strong, and as compared to Leth, it can do AoE but also single target without really a big compromise. It has good utility, Intercede can save your healers sometimes, and as opposed to PvP, there are no Madness Sorcerers tunneling you in PvE. Reflect helps on Isaacs for pushing sooner, and also Mad Dash is stronger in PvE compared to PvP, because with a bit of experience you can use it to completely negate incoming damage in important moments of a fight, such as the bombs on the first boss in R4 for example. Next up we have Annihilation Marauder. If you watch my PvP tier lists, you will know that I really don't like the spec. I think it sucks in PvP because players tend to kite you. They don't just tend to stand there and let you put the dots on them continuously. But in PvE you do have higher uptime because unless your tank is trolling, the boss shouldn't really kite you that much. So the higher uptime is really good for melee based dot specs, but then also when you do have movement phases, your dots will keep ticking, meaning that you have a little advantage over some of the burst or direct damage specs in the game. But of course, what makes Annihilation stronger than the other Marauder specs and one of the best specs in the game is the utility you get from the heals. So in PvP, those heals are not that great because again, the uptime on your dots will not always be guaranteed. But in PvE, the extra healing you get from your dots as Annihilation can really help to take some pressure off your healers, and means that in those tight phases where the whole raid is taking AoE damage, you will have a bit of an easier time. And because of the extra HPS that you do as Annihilation, the healers can focus on keeping the priority targets, usually the tanks, alive. And that's why Annihilation is one of the best specs in PvE in the game and sits comfortably in S tier. Now, we talked about how good APPT burst is in PvP. If you watch my videos, you will know that you can do up to 300k damage in 2 seconds. But in PvE, you are not going to one-shot a boss in a hard stun. It's more about the longer burst phases with explosive fuel, and that's where the longer sustained burst, if you want to call it like that, of PowerTech PT shines. Compared to AP, Pyro is also tankier and has a better sustained damage. It is better in movement phases because you can just dot up your targets, and your dots will keep doing damage to the boss even if you have to move. But Pyro is also better at doing damage to multiple targets by spamming Scorch, and you can use Searing Waves or just spam Flame Sweep as well. Of course, Pyro is also a PT, so the utility is quite good. You have Sonic Rebounder, which allows your whole raid to ignore some mechanics. And overall, that means even after the recent nerfs, Pyro is still one of the absolute best specs for Nightmare raiding in the game. Okay, so just ignore Virulence here, we have it twice in the list for some reason. And next we are gonna move on to talk about the tanks. Now for tanks in PvE, it is more about skipping mechanics, and that is why Darkness Assassin is the best tank of the bunch. Darkness, of course, has stealth, Shroud is also really strong at just completely avoiding mechanics. The single target DPS is a bit worse than the other 2 tanks, but the difference of 1 to 2k DPS does not really matter that much, just find some better DPS players. Or if you can't, you can also spec into some more offensive options as Darkness, or even run some DPS gear. Because if you can avoid the big hitting boss mechanics, you do not always need to be full death tank. Shield Tech would be the second best tank at the moment. It is very tanky, has some good extra damage via the superheated fuel tactical. It is also good at kiting with hydraulics, meaning you can keep aggro on the boss while still doing some damage. And the emergency power buff from the super commando implant lets you skip mechanics similar to the Sin tank. Now Jug Tank is kind of the worst of the 3. It cannot really avoid mechanics as easily as the other 2 tanks, meaning it takes more damage than Shield Tech or Darkness. And while the DPS is good, Jug Tank also sucks in movement phases when you have to kite the boss, because you are mostly 4 meter range, meaning you can't really do damage while moving. And that is why if you're on a boss where you need 2 tanks, ideally you want to have either 2 Darkness Assassins or 1 Sin and 1 PowerTech. Finally, we talk about the best healers, and here Bodyguard and Corruption Sorcerer are pretty much equal and both of the S tier healers. Bodyguard can take a lot of damage, has great single target burst heals, but also great sustain, multi-target heals with Kolto Shells. Now Sorcerer is also really strong, but keep in mind that for all fights where you need 2 healers, which is almost all of them, unless you're really experienced or overgeared, you never really want to have 2 bodyguards or 2 Sorc heals. And that's because the Kolto Shells and also Static Barrier are unique buffs, meaning if you run 2 bodyguard healers, for example, the second one will override the Kolto Shells of the first one, and you just wasted an ability. So instead you always pair them and you combine 1 bodyguard with 1 corruption healer. So the whole raid can have bubbles and Kolto Shells. Finally then, the last class in the list, Medicine, is a bit behind the other 2 healers. While it can compete on top HPS with their HOTS, it is a bit risky because Medicine Operative is quite squishy and prone to dying, which means you will wipe more compared to the other 2 heals. And that is why, rounding out the list, Medicine sits only in B tier. So that's the list. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.